A single gunshot echoed through the vast New Mexico territory as Jillian Abernathy's husband slumped forward, blood blooming across his chest like a macabre flower against the fading light of the 1878 sunset. She had been a wife for exactly 3 weeks, and now, at 22 years of age, she was a widow, alone on the unforgiving frontier with nothing but a half-built homestead and her husband's unrealized dreams. 6 months later, the bitter March wind whipped through the small town of Copper Creek, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of an early spring. Jillian pushed a strand of auburn hair from her face as she stepped onto the weathered boardwalk, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The town had grown since she'd first arrived, now boasting a general store, a blacksmith, 2 saloons, and the recently opened Hayes Hotel and Restaurant where she had found employment after selling off most of the homestead to pay her late husband's debts. "Evening, Mrs. Abernathy," Sheriff Dawson called as he passed, tipping his hat. The townsfolk had been kind enough, treating her with a mixture of pity and respect that she both appreciated and resented. "Sheriff," she replied with a nod, continuing toward the hotel where she worked 6 nights a week serving meals to travelers and locals alike. The position wasn't what she had envisioned for herself when she'd left Pennsylvania with stars in her eyes and a new husband by her side, but it kept a roof over her head and food in her belly. The Hayes Hotel dining room was already half full when Jillian entered through the back door, quickly donning her apron and smoothing down her simple dark blue dress. Martha Hayes, the proprietor's wife, glanced up from the pot she was stirring. "Just in time, Jillian. We've got a cattle drive passing through. The Cowboys have been coming in all afternoon." Jillian nodded, gathering her serving tray and steeling herself for the boisterous evening ahead. Cowboys meant good tips, but also wandering hands and crude comments. She had learned to handle both with a firm voice and an unwavering stare. The dining room hummed with conversation and the clinking of silverware against plates. Jillian moved efficiently between tables, refilling coffee cups and delivering plates of Martha's renowned beef stew and freshly baked bread. Her feet ached, and her back protested each time she bent to place a plate before a customer, but she kept her smile fixed firmly in place. It was nearly 8 o'clock when the swinging doors to the dining room opened, admitting a gust of cool evening air and a tall figure that seemed to fill the doorway. Jillian glanced up briefly before returning her attention to the table she was serving, but something about the newcomer caused her to look again. He stood just inside the entrance, removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. Dust from the trail covered his worn denim trousers and the leather chaps that protected his legs. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though his expression now was serious as he surveyed the room. "Madam," he nodded to Martha, who gestured toward an empty table near the window. The stranger made his way through the crowded room, his spurs jingling softly with each step. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard work and long hours in the saddle. Jillian watched as he settled at the table, placing his hat carefully on the empty chair beside him before running a hand through his hair. "I'll be right with you," she called, finishing with her current table before approaching the newcomer. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a startling shade of blue, the color of the sky just before dusk. They crinkled at the corners as he looked up at her. "What can I get for you this evening?" she asked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Whatever's hot and plentiful, madam," he replied, his voice deep and graveled from trail dust. "Been riding since dawn. Mrs. Hayes's beef stew is the specialty tonight, comes with fresh bread and coffee. Sounds perfect." He studied her face for a moment longer than was necessary for the simple exchange. "Much obliged." Jillian nodded and turned toward the kitchen, aware of his eyes following her. She'd grown accustomed to the attention of men passing through town, but something about this one felt different. There was an intensity to his gaze that wasn't predatory or disrespectful, but rather curious. Almost concerned, when she returned with his meal, he thanked her with a genuine smile that transformed his rugged features, softening them in a way that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "Elias Blackwood," he offered as she placed the steaming bowl before him. "Just passing through with a herd bound for Kansas." "Jillian Abernathy," she replied, the formality of the introduction feeling strangely intimate in the busy dining room. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Abernathy." His emphasis on the Mrs. was subtle but unmistakable, a question disguised as acknowledgement. "It's just me now," she found herself saying, though she normally kept her personal circumstances to herself. "My husband passed 6 months ago," Elias nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Thank you," she replied, already turning to attend to another table, surprised at how easily the words had come. She rarely spoke of Thomas anymore, finding it easier to keep her grief private. Throughout the evening, as the dining room gradually emptied, Jillian was acutely aware of Elias Blackwood's presence. He ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it might be his last decent meal for some time, which, if he was on a cattle drive, was likely true. He ordered a second cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie, lingering as the other cowboys departed for the saloons down the street. By 9:30, only Elias and an elderly couple staying at the hotel remained in the dining room. Jillian began clearing the empty tables, her arms laden with dirty dishes as she made trips back and forth to the kitchen. On one such return, she found Elias standing, hat in hand. "That was the finest meal I've had in months," he said, placing a generous tip on the table. "Thank you." "You're welcome," she replied, offering him a small smile. "Safe travels to Kansas," he nodded, settling his hat on his head but making no move toward the door. Instead, he seemed to be weighing his words carefully. "Mrs. Abernathy Jillian," he began, his voice low. "I couldn't help but notice you dining alone earlier, before your shift began." Jillian blinked in surprise. She had indeed taken her own supper at a small corner table before the evening rush, as was her habit. "I'm heading to the Silverton Saloon for a drink," he continued. "Nothing rowdy, just a quiet nightcap. I wondered if you might care to join me when you're finished here." The invitation caught her off guard. Since Thomas's death, she had rebuffed all such overtures, unwilling to subject herself to the gossip that would inevitably follow a widow seen in the company of another man, especially a stranger. But something in Elias Blackwood's direct gaze made her hesitate rather than immediately decline. "I'm not in the habit of accepting invitations from men I don't know, Mr. Blackwood," she said finally. "Fair enough," he replied with a nod. "But no night should be spent alone if there's good company to be had, and I suspect you've had more than your share of lonely evenings." His eyes held hers, and in them she saw not pity but understanding, as though he too knew the weight of solitude. Jillian felt a flutter of something long dormant stirring within her. It wasn't merely attraction, though Elias Blackwood was certainly a handsome man. It was the possibility of connection, of sharing an hour with someone who seemed to see past her widow's grief to the woman beneath. "I finish at 10, she heard herself say. "I could meet you for one drink." A smile spread across his face, genuine and warm. "I'll be waiting," he said, touching the brim of his hat before turning toward the door. As Jillian watched him leave, she wondered what had possessed her to accept. One drink with a passing cowboy meant nothing, she told herself. He would be gone tomorrow, continuing north with his herd, and she would return to her quiet life of work and solitude. But for tonight, perhaps she could allow herself this small deviation from routine. The remaining 30 minutes of her shift passed slowly. Jillian found herself glancing at the clock above the kitchen door more frequently than necessary, as she completed her closing duties. Martha Hayes gave her a curious look when she asked to leave promptly at 10 rather than staying to help with the final cleanup, as she sometimes did. "Got plans tonight, do you?" Martha asked with a knowing smile. "Just a drink," Jillian replied, feeling a blush creep up her neck. "With the cowboy who came in late." Martha nodded approvingly. "The tall one with the kind eyes, I noticed him watching you." "It's about time you started living again, Jillian. Thomas wouldn't have wanted you to bury yourself with him." Jillian merely nodded, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. She had heard similar sentiments from well-meaning townspeople for months now, but none of them truly understood what it meant to rebuild a life from ashes. After changing out of her work dress into the only other decent outfit, she owned a simple green skirt and cream-colored blouse that had once been her Sunday best. Jillian made her way toward the Silverton saloon. The night air had grown cooler, and she wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she walked the short distance down the main street. The Silverton was the more respectable of the town's two saloons, catering to businessmen and travelers rather than the rougher cowboys and miners who preferred the rowdier atmosphere of the Red Dog at the edge of town. Still, Jillian paused at the Batwing doors, second-guessing her decision. A respectable woman, especially a widow, risked her reputation by entering such an establishment unchaperoned. Before she could change her mind, Elias appeared in the doorway as if sensing her hesitation. "I was beginning to think you'd reconsidered," he said, holding the door open for her. "I nearly did," she admitted, stepping past him into the warm, dimly lit interior. The saloon was relatively quiet for the hour, with several tables occupied by card players and a few men standing at the long mahogany bar. A piano player in the corner provided soft background music, his fingers moving lazily over the keys. Elias guided her to a small table near the back, partially screened from the rest of the room by a potted palm that had seen better days. A few heads turned as they passed, and Jillian felt the weight of curious stares on her back. By tomorrow, the gossips would be busy with speculation about the widow Abernathy and the strange cowboy. "What would you like to drink?" Elias asked after she was seated. "Just a small sherry, please," she replied, removing her shawl and draping it over the back of her chair. While he went to the bar, Jillian took the opportunity to study him more carefully. His movements were fluid and deliberate, his back straight despite what must have been hours of hard riding. When he returned with their drinks, sherry for her, whiskey for himself, she noticed the calluses on his hands and the small scar that ran along the edge of his left palm. "To new acquaintances," he said, raising his glass. "To new acquaintances," she echoed, taking a small sip of the sweet wine. "So, Mrs. Abernathy, Jillian, please," she interrupted. "If we're sharing a drink, we might as well use our given names." He smiled. "Jillian, then, how did you come to be in Copper Creek? Your accent suggests you're not originally from these parts." "No, I'm from Pennsylvania originally. My husband Thomas and I came west last summer. He had grand plans to establish a horse breeding operation." She paused, running her finger along the rim of her glass. "He was killed by rustlers before we'd even properly settled." Elias's expression sobered. "I'm truly sorry." "That's a hard way to lose someone." "It was," she agreed simply. "And you, are you a drover by profession, or is this cattle drive just temporary work?" "I've been a lot of things," he replied. "Soldier during the war, ranch hand, horse trainer. For the past few years, I've been working as a trail boss for various outfits between Texas and Kansas. This particular herd belongs to a rancher named Hargrove out of San Antonio. You've seen a lot of the country then. More than most, I suppose." "Never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots." There was a hint of regret in his voice that resonated with Jillian's own sense of displacement. The conversation flowed easily after that, moving from their respective backgrounds to lighter topics. Elias described some of the more memorable characters he'd encountered on the trail, his stories bringing laughter to Jillian's lips for the first time in months. In turn, she shared anecdotes from her childhood in Pennsylvania and her early teaching career before her marriage. "You were a school teacher," Elias asked, clearly intrigued. "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "I miss the children and the sense of purpose, but there's no school in Copper Creek yet, though there's talk of building one by next year." "You should apply for the position," he suggested. "You clearly have a passion for it." "Perhaps I will," she replied, though in truth she had already considered it. The thought of returning to teaching gave her a glimmer of hope for a future beyond simply surviving day to day. As their glasses emptied, Jillian became aware of how late the hour had grown. The saloon had quieted further, with only a handful of patrons remaining. She had enjoyed Elias's company far more than she had anticipated, finding in him an unexpected kindred spirit. But the reality remained that he was passing through, and tomorrow would bring a return to her solitary existence. "I should be going," she said reluctantly, reaching for her shawl. "It's getting late," Elias nodded, standing as she rose from her chair. "Allow me to walk you home. These streets can be unpredictable after dark." The offer was practical rather than presumptuous, and Jillian accepted with a grateful nod. They stepped out into the night, now fully dark with only the occasional glow of lamplight from windows to guide their way. Elias offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Jillian placed her hand lightly upon it. "I'm staying in a small room above the milliner's shop," she explained as they walked. "It's not much, but it's clean and the rent is reasonable." "You've made a life for yourself here," Elias observed. "That takes courage, necessity more than courage," she replied. "I had nowhere else to go after Thomas died. The land we purchased was too much for me to manage alone, and his debts consumed most of what we had." They reached the narrow staircase that led to her lodgings, and Jillian turned to face him. In the soft moonlight, his features seemed both stronger and gentler, his eyes reflecting the scattered stars above. "Thank you for the drink and the conversation," she said. "It was unexpected, but very welcome." "The pleasure was mine," he replied, his voice low. "Perhaps before I leave town, we might have dinner together. I'd like to hear more about that school you hope to teach in someday." The invitation hung between them, fraught with possibilities Jillian had not allowed herself to consider for a long time. She knew the sensible answer was to decline, to protect herself from forming an attachment to a man whose life was lived on the move. But the evening had awakened something in her, a hunger not just for companionship, but for the particular companionship of this man, who seemed to understand the language of loss and resilience that she spoke. "I'd like that," she said finally. "When do you leave?" "The herd needs a day of rest, and we need to restock supplies. We'll be here through tomorrow night, leaving at first light the day after. Then tomorrow evening. I don't work on Sundays." His smile was answer enough, but he added, "I'll call for you at 6 if that suits." "It does," she replied, suddenly feeling as nervous as a schoolgirl. "Good night, Elias." "Good night, Jillian," he said, tipping his hat before stepping back to allow her to ascend the stairs. At her door, she turned to look down at him, still standing where she had left him, watching to ensure she entered safely. A small gesture, but one that touched her deeply. With a final wave, she slipped inside, leaning against the closed door as her heart raced with emotions long dormant. One dinner, she told herself. One more evening of conversation before he rode out of her life as suddenly as he had entered it. There was no harm in that, surely. But as Jillian prepared for bed in her small, sparse room, she could not deny the spark of hope that had ignited within her, hope not just for a pleasant evening, but for the possibility that life might yet hold more for her than memories and regrets. The following day passed with agonizing slowness. Jillian attended the small Methodist church service in the morning, where she found herself distracted during Reverend Fletcher's sermon, her thoughts repeatedly drifting to the evening ahead. After church, she declined Martha Hayes's invitation to Sunday dinner, claiming a headache, though in truth she wanted time to prepare for her dinner with Elias. Back in her room, she spent an unusual amount of time contemplating her limited wardrobe. Finally settling on her best dress, a deep burgundy with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, she then devoted attention to her hair, arranging it in a style more elaborate than her usual practical knot. The woman who looked back at her from the small mirror above her washstand seemed both familiar and strange, with flushed cheeks and bright eyes that spoke of anticipation rather than resignation. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at her door. Taking a deep breath to steady her inexplicably fluttering nerves, Jillian opened it to find Elias standing on her threshold, hat in hand. He had clearly made efforts with his own appearance, wearing a clean shirt and string tie beneath his freshly brushed coat. His hair was neatly combed, though one rebellious lock had already fallen across his forehead. "Evening, Jillian," he greeted her, his eyes warming as they took in her appearance. "You look lovely." "Thank you," she replied, reaching for her shawl. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Blackwood." His chuckle was deep and genuine. "High praise coming from a lady like yourself. Shall we?" To Jillian's surprise, Elias led her not to the hotel restaurant or one of the saloons, but to a small clearing on the outskirts of town near the creek that gave the settlement its name. There, beneath a large cottonwood tree, he had arranged a picnic supper complete with a blanket spread on the ground and a basket that she recognized as coming from the hotel kitchen. "Mrs. Hayes was kind enough to prepare us a meal when I explained my intentions," he said, noting her surprise. "I hope you don't mind dining al fresco. The evening is mild, and I thought you might appreciate the privacy. Being seen twice in my company might set tongues wagging." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Jillian deeply. "It's perfect," she assured him, settling on the blanket as he unpacked the basket. The meal was simple but delicious: cold fried chicken, potato salad, fresh bread, and peach preserves with apple tarts for dessert. Elias had even managed to procure a bottle of decent wine, which he poured into 2 tin cups with an apologetic smile for the rustic vessels. "To unexpected encounters," he proposed as they touched cups. "And new beginnings," Jillian added, surprising herself with the sentiment. As they ate, the conversation picked up where it had left off the previous evening, flowing naturally between serious topics and lighter moments. Elias spoke of his experiences during the war serving with the Union cavalry and his restless years afterward, unable to settle back into civilian life. Jillian shared more about her teaching career and her brief, hopeful marriage to Thomas, a kind man whose dreams had exceeded his practical abilities. "He was so certain we would make a fortune breeding horses," she recalled with a sad smile. "He knew nothing about horses except that he loved them, but he was convinced that passion was enough." "Sometimes passion is the most important ingredient," Elias observed, "but it helps to have experience and a healthy dose of caution as well." The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Elias lit a small lantern he had brought, casting a warm glow over their picnic as darkness gradually enveloped them. Crickets began their evening chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. "I've missed this," Jillian admitted softly, gazing up at the emerging stars. "Not just companionship, but sharing beauty with someone who appreciates it." Elias's eyes were on her face rather than the sky. "Some beauty demands to be witnessed," he said quietly. "It seems wrong for it to exist unseen." The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken possibilities. Jillian felt herself drawn toward him as surely as the tide to shore, a pull both physical and emotional that frightened and exhilarated her. "Tell me about your herd," she said suddenly, breaking the tension. "How many cattle are you driving to Kansas?" If Elias was disappointed by the change in subject, he didn't show it. "Nearly 2,000 head," he replied, accepting her retreat. "Mostly longhorns with a few crossbreeds." "It's a good herd, strong and healthy, should fetch a fair price in Dodge City." "And after that, where will you go?" He was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'm not sure," he admitted finally. "I've been on the trail for a long time. Nearly 10 years of moving from one drive to the next, one ranch to another. Lately I've been thinking it might be time to stop roaming." "What would you do instead?" Jillian asked, trying to ignore the sudden quickening of her pulse. "I've saved enough to buy a small spread of my own. Nothing fancy, just enough land to run some cattle and maybe breed a few horses." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the lantern light. "A man gets tired of having no place to call home." The words hung between them, laden with implications neither was ready to voice. Jillian looked down at her hands, twisting the simple gold band she still wore on her left finger. "Home is a precious thing," she said softly. "I thought I had found mine with Thomas, but it slipped away before it ever truly existed." "Perhaps home isn't always a place," Elias suggested. "Sometimes it's a feeling, a sense of belonging that you carry with you." "Is that what you're looking for? Belonging, among other things?" His gaze was steady on hers. "What about you, Jillian? What are you looking for here in Copper Creek?" The question pierced straight to the heart of her uncertainty. "I don't know," she admitted. "For months I've just been existing, taking each day as it comes, surviving, but lately." She hesitated, searching for words to describe the restlessness that had begun to grow within her. "Lately I've started to wonder if there might be more for me than just memories of what might have been." Elias reached across the space between them, his hand covering hers where it rested on the blanket. The touch was gentle, asking rather than demanding, and Jillian found herself turning her palm upward to intertwine her fingers with his. "There's always more," he said, his voice low and certain. "As long as we're breathing, there are possibilities ahead we can't even imagine." The simplicity of the statement, delivered with such conviction, brought unexpected tears to Jillian's eyes. She had been so focused on what she had lost that she had forgotten the vastness of what might still lie ahead. "I should get back," she said, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. "It's getting late," Elias nodded, beginning to pack up the remains of their picnic. "Of course." They walked back toward town in companionable silence, the lantern lighting their path through the deepening darkness. Jillian was acutely aware of Elias beside her, of the occasional brush of his arm against hers, of the scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him. At the foot of the stairs leading to her room, they paused. The town was quiet, most of its inhabitants already retired for the night. In the distance, a dog barked briefly before falling silent. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Jillian said, turning to face him. "I can't remember the last time I enjoyed myself so much." "The pleasure was mine," Elias replied, setting down the picnic basket and lantern. In the golden light, his face was a study in shadows and angles, his blue eyes dark with emotion. "Jillian, he trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words, a condition she suspected was rare for him. Then, with a gentleness that took her breath away, he reached up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "May I write to you?" he asked finally. "After I reach Kansas." The request was so unexpected, and yet so perfectly right that Jillian felt something shift inside her, like the final tumbler of a lock falling into place. "I'd like that very much," she whispered. Elias smiled, relief evident in his expression. Then, moving slowly enough that she could have stepped away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss as soft as a promise. It lasted only a moment, but in that brief contact, Jillian felt years of grief and loneliness begin to melt away, replaced by a cautious hope. When he drew back, his eyes searched her face as if memorizing each feature. "I leave at dawn," he said. "But this isn't goodbye, Jillian, not if you don't want it to be." "I don't want it to be," she admitted, the words coming from a place of truth she hadn't known existed within her until this moment. "Then it isn't," he said simply. "Good night, Jillian Abernathy, dream well." "Good night, Elias," she replied, reluctantly turning toward the stairs. At the top, she looked back to find him still watching, the lantern light gilding his figure against the darkness. He raised a hand in farewell, and she returned the gesture before entering her room. Inside, Jillian leaned against the door, her heart racing and her lips still tingling from his kiss. 2 days ago, she had been a widow going through the motions of living, her future as empty as her evenings. Now, standing in the same small room, she felt as though the world had somehow expanded, revealing possibilities she had believed forever close to her. She did not expect declarations of love or promises of forever from a man she had known for barely 2 days. That would be foolish, and Jillian Abernathy was not a fool. But she had glimpsed in Elias Blackwood a kindred spirit, someone who understood loss, but had not been defined by it, who saw in her not just the widow in mourning, but the woman capable of joy. As she prepared for bed, Jillian found herself already composing her first letter to him in her mind, imagining his trail-worn hands unfolding the paper in some distant camp. For the first time since Thomas's death, she looked forward to the dawn not with resignation but with anticipation, eager to see what the new day might bring. Tomorrow, Elias would ride north with his herd, and she would return to her work at the hotel. But something had changed, irrevocably. A connection had been forged between them, spanning the distance that would soon separate them. Whether it would grow into something more remained to be seen, but for now, it was enough to know that her nights need not be lonely, even when she dined alone. Dawn broke clear and cool over Copper Creek, painting the eastern sky in delicate watercolors of pink and gold. Jillian had slept little, her mind too full of the previous evening's events to find rest. Rising early, she dressed with care, pinning her hair simply but neatly before making her way downstairs and out into the quiet streets. The cattle drive was already preparing to depart. The herd gathered at the northern edge of town under the watchful eyes of drovers on horseback. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the slanting rays of the rising sun, and the lowing of cattle mingled with the occasional shout of a cowboy and the creak of leather. Jillian stood at a distance, uncertain of her welcome in this masculine domain of work and sweat. But then she saw him, Elias, astride a powerful chestnut gelding, issuing orders with the easy authority of a man accustomed to command. As if sensing her presence, he turned, his eyes scanning the periphery until they found her standing apart from the activity. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his expression softening into something that made her heart skip. Then he wheeled his horse and rode toward her, reining in a few feet away. "I didn't expect to see you this early," he said, swinging down from the saddle. "I wanted to wish you a safe journey," Jillian replied, suddenly shy in the face of his evident pleasure at her presence. Elias closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. "It means a great deal that you came." "I brought you something," she said, reaching into her pocket to withdraw a small parcel wrapped in tissue paper. "It isn't much, but—" He accepted it with a curious smile, carefully unwrapping the paper to reveal a handkerchief embroidered with his initials in blue thread. Jillian had stayed up most of the night completing it, working by lamplight until her eyes burned. "You made this. When did you find time?" "Let's just say I didn't get much sleep," she admitted with a small laugh. "I wanted you to have something to remember me by." Elias's fingers closed around the small token, his expression solemn. "I don't need this to remember you, Jillian, but I'll treasure it nonetheless." He carefully tucked it into his shirt pocket close to his heart. "I have something for you as well." Reaching into his coat, he withdrew a small leather-bound book. "Poetry," he explained as he handed it to her. "Whitman, I've carried it with me for years. I'd like you to have it." Jillian opened the book carefully, noting the dog-eared pages and margin notes in a strong, slanting hand. "I can't take this from you," she protested. "It's clearly precious to you." "That's precisely why I want you to have it," he said. "Something of mine to keep with you until I return." The word "until" rather than "if" hung between them, a promise neither had anticipated making so soon. "Boss." A voice called from the herd. "We're ready to move out." Elias nodded acknowledgement without turning away from Jillian. "I have to go," he said, regret evident in his voice. "But I meant what I said last night. This isn't goodbye." "I know," Jillian replied, clutching the book to her chest. "I'll write to you in Dodge City. And I'll write back as soon as I receive your letter." He hesitated, clearly torn between duty and desire. Then, with a swift movement that took her by surprise, he pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss far less tentative than the one they had shared the night before. Jillian responded instinctively, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. The kiss deepened, communicating what words could not, longing, hope, and the bittersweet ache of parting. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Elias rested his forehead against hers for a brief moment. "I'll come back," he whispered. "That's a promise, Jillian Abernathy." Then he was gone, swinging back into the saddle with the fluid grace of a man born to ride. He tipped his hat to her one last time before wheeling his horse around and galloping back to take his place at the head of the herd. A series of shouts echoed through the morning air, and the cattle began to move, a living river flowing north under the guidance of men and horses. Jillian watched until the dust cloud that accompanied the herd had diminished to a smudge on the horizon, the book of poetry clutched tightly in her hands. Only then did she turn back toward town, her steps lighter than they had been in months, despite the hollow ache of separation already forming in her chest. The following weeks passed in a blur of routine, punctuated by the anticipation of letters. Jillian continued her work at the Hayes Hotel, serving meals with the same efficiency as before, though customers and coworkers alike commented on the change in her demeanor. There was a vibrancy about her now, a presence that had been muted during the long months of mourning. True to his word, Elias wrote from the trail, his letters arriving sporadically as they made their way through settlements along the cattle route. His handwriting was as she had imagined from the notes in the poetry book, strong and slightly slanted, with occasional flourishes that hinted at her romantic nature beneath his practical exterior. He wrote of the journey, the challenges of river crossings, the beauty of landscapes few ever witnessed, the camaraderie of the men who rode with him. Between the lines, Jillian read his growing certainty that this would be his final cattle drive, his last season of wandering before seeking something more permanent. She wrote back, her letters sent ahead to Dodge City to await his arrival. She told him of the small changes in Copper Creek, the new family that had settled just outside town, the progress on the schoolhouse, the gossip that had indeed flared briefly after their dinner together, but quickly died down for lack of fuel. In her third letter, Jillian finally removed her wedding ring, enclosing it within the envelope along with a pressing of wildflowers from the creek bank where they had shared their picnic. The gesture was both closure for her past and opening to her future, a future she increasingly hoped might include Elias Blackwood. May turned to June, and with the changing season came news that the cattle drive had reached Dodge City. Elias's letter from Kansas was longer than his previous missives, filled with details of the successful sale of the herd and his plans for the immediate future. "I've settled my accounts with Hargrove," he wrote. "My share of the profits, combined with my savings, is enough to make a start on that ranch I mentioned. I've been looking at land in Colorado Territory, good grazing, plenty of water, and growing settlements nearby that would provide a market for beef and horses. But before I make any decisions, there's something I need to know." The letter continued, the words causing Jillian's heart to race as she read them in the privacy of her room. "These past weeks have given me time to think about what I want, about who I want to be, and about who I want beside me as I build this next chapter of my life. I find my thoughts constantly returning to you, Jillian. To your strength, your grace, and the connection I felt between us from the first moment I saw you dining alone. I won't presume to know your feelings or to rush you toward decisions you're not ready to make, but I am coming back to Copper Creek as I promised. I should arrive by the end of June, and when I do, I hope to have a conversation about possibilities for both of us." The letter was signed simply, "Yours, Elias," but those two words contained a world of meaning that kept Jillian awake far into the night, her mind filled with images of what might be. As June waned, Jillian found herself watching the road north with increasing frequency, her heart leaping at the sight of any rider approaching town. She had taken special care with her appearance each morning, just in case today might be the day Elias returned. On the 28th of June, a Tuesday unremarkable in every other way, Jillian was arranging fresh wildflowers on the tables of the hotel dining room when Martha Hayes burst through the kitchen door, her round face flushed with excitement. "Jillian." "There's someone asking for you at the front desk." Jillian's hands stilled, her pulse quickening. "Is it?" Martha nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Tall fellow with the nicest blue eyes I've ever seen on a man, said his name is Blackwood and he's looking for Mrs. Abernathy." Setting down the flowers with trembling hands, Jillian smoothed her apron and patted her hair before making her way through the kitchen and into the hotel lobby. And there he was, standing by the reception desk, hat in hand, looking both familiar and somehow new, as though the weeks apart had sharpened rather than diminished her memory of him. Elias turned at the sound of her approach, and the smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. For a moment, neither spoke, the space between them charged with all that remained unsaid. Then Jillian was moving forward, propriety forgotten as she crossed the lobby to stand before him. "You came back," she said simply, unable to keep the joy from her voice. "I promised I would," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "And I'm a man who keeps his promises, Jillian." Behind them, Martha Hayes cleared her throat meaningfully. "Why don't you take the afternoon off, Jillian? I'm sure you and Mr. Blackwood have a lot to catch up on." Grateful for the woman's understanding, Jillian nodded. "Thank you, Martha. I'll make up the time tomorrow." "Don't you worry about that." Martha waved away her concern. Just go on now. Outside in the bright June sunshine, Jillian and Elias walked side by side down the main street, their steps automatically turning toward the creek where they had shared their picnic. The town had changed little in the month since Elias's departure, but Jillian herself felt transformed, no longer the grieving widow waiting for life to happen to her, but a woman actively choosing her path forward. "How was your journey back from Kansas?" she asked as they walked, suddenly shy despite the letters they had exchanged. "Long," Elias replied with a rueful smile. "I rode hard the last few days, eager to reach Copper Creek." He glanced at her, his expression growing serious. "Eager to see you again." They reached the creek bank, the cottonwood tree spreading its shade over the spot where they had dined by lantern light. By unspoken agreement, they stopped beneath its branches, the babbling water providing a soothing backdrop to the conversation that both knew was coming. "I've thought about you every day," Elias said, turning to face her fully. "About your letters, about the time we shared, about the woman who dined alone but whose strength and spirit captured my attention from the first moment." Jillian felt a blush rise to her cheeks at his words. "I've thought about you too," she admitted, "more than I probably should have." "I meant what I wrote," he continued, taking a step closer. "About wanting to settle down to build something lasting. I found land in Colorado, a beautiful valley with a creek much like this one running through it. Good soil, good water, good prospects." He reached for her hands, holding them gently in his own. "But a piece of land is just that, earth and grass and water. It takes more to make a home." Jillian's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "What are you saying, Elias?" "I'm saying that I know we've known each other only briefly, that perhaps this seems rushed or impulsive. But in my 40 years, I've learned to recognize what matters. And you, Jillian Abernathy, matter to me in ways I never expected." He drew a deep breath, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. "I'm not asking for promises yet. That would be unfair to both of us. But I am asking if you might consider coming to Colorado with me to see the land, to explore the possibility of a future there. Together." The invitation hung between them, breathtaking in its implications. Jillian looked into Elias's eyes, seeing in them the same hope and uncertainty that filled her own heart. "When would we leave?" she asked, the question itself an answer of sorts. Relief and joy spread across Elias's features. "As soon as you're ready. A week, 2 weeks, whatever time you need to settle your affairs here." Jillian thought of her small room above the milliner's shop, of her position at the hotel, of the tentative roots she had put down in Copper Creek after Thomas's death. None of it held her as strongly as the possibility that stood before her now, offering not just survival but a chance at genuine happiness. 2 weeks, she decided. "I'll need to give notice at the hotel and pack my belongings." Elias nodded, visibly restraining his excitement. 2 weeks it is. Then more softly, "Thank you, Jillian, for trusting me enough to consider this." "I do trust you," she realized aloud, "more than I've trusted anyone in a very long time." He lifted one hand to her cheek, his touch reverent. "I won't let you regret it." As the sun dappled through the cottonwood leaves above them, Jillian tilted her face up to his, inviting the kiss that followed. Unlike their previous embraces, tinged with the bittersweetness of imminent parting, this kiss was a beginning full of promise and the heady anticipation of adventures yet to come. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Martha Hayes received Jillian's resignation with a knowing smile and a warm hug, confessing that she had suspected something of the sort from the moment Elias returned. "He's a good man," she said, patting Jillian's hand. "I can see it in his eyes when he looks at you. And you deserve happiness, my dear." Word spread quickly through the small town that the widow Abernathy was departing for Colorado with the trail boss who had passed through in May. Some eyebrows were raised at the seeming haste of the arrangement, but most who knew Jillian were simply pleased to see the light return to her eyes after so many months of quiet grief. Elias took a room at the Hayes Hotel for the duration of their stay, spending his days acquiring supplies for their journey and making arrangements for transportation. Evenings were spent in Jillian's company, often walking along the creek or sitting on the hotel porch, planning their future with increasingly specific detail. The house will need to be built, Elias explained one evening as they studied a rough sketch he had made of the property. But there's a cabin that will serve us well enough until then. It's small but solid, 2 rooms with a good stone fireplace. It sounds perfect, Jillian replied, her imagination filling in the details. He omitted curtains at the windows, a garden patch nearby, perhaps chickens scratching in the yard. As their departure date approached, Jillian found herself visiting Thomas's grave one final time. The simple wooden marker stood in the small cemetery at the edge of town, already beginning to weather from exposure to the elements. "I'm leaving Copper Creek," she told him quietly, kneeling to place a bunch of wildflowers at the base of the marker. "I think you would understand. You always wanted me to be happy, and now I have a chance to be." The warm summer breeze rustled the grass around the grave, as if in response. Jillian felt a sense of peace settle over her, not forgetting, but accepting that life continued, and that love, in its infinite capacity, could encompass both memory and new beginning. On the morning of their departure, Jillian stood on the boardwalk outside the milliner's shop, watching as Elias secured her trunk to the back of the wagon he had purchased for their journey. Her worldly possessions amounted to pitifully little clothes, books, a few keepsakes, and the small walnut jewelry box that had been her mother's. Everything else she needed for their new life would be acquired along the way or once they reached Colorado. "Ready?" Elias asked, offering his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. Jillian looked back at the town that had been her refuge during the darkest period of her life. Copper Creek had served its purpose, sheltering her when she needed it most, but it had never truly been home. "Ready," she confirmed, taking his hand and climbing up beside him. As the wagon rolled out of town, heading west toward the distant mountains that marked the Colorado Territory, Jillian felt a curious mixture of trepidation and exhilaration. She was leaving behind the known for the unknown, security for possibility, grief for hope. The journey to Colorado would take nearly 2 weeks, Elias had explained, following established trails through increasingly rugged country. They would pass through small settlements and trading posts, camp beneath the stars when towns were too distant, and gradually climb into the higher elevations where Elias's land awaited. The first few days established a comfortable routine. They traveled from sunrise until mid-afternoon, stopping early enough to make camp while daylight remained. Elias insisted on Jillian taking the small tent he had purchased for her privacy, while he slept under the wagon or beside the fire, depending on the weather. Their conversations during these days on the trail deepened, moving beyond the careful exchanges of their letters to more substantial discussions of beliefs, dreams, and the practicalities of the life they were heading toward. Jillian learned that beneath Elias's confident exterior lay a thoughtful man with firmly held convictions about justice, honor, and the importance of community. In turn, she shared with him her hopes for eventually establishing a school on or near their property, her desire for children someday, and her determination to be a true partner in their enterprise rather than merely a helpmate. "I don't want to be protected from the realities of ranch life," she told him one evening as they sat beside their campfire, the vast canopy of stars spreading above them. "I want to learn to contribute in meaningful ways." Elias nodded, his expression serious in the flickering light. "I wouldn't have it any other way. A partnership only works when both parties are equally invested." As they traveled farther west, the landscape changed dramatically, rolling plains giving way to foothills, and eventually the imposing presence of mountains on the horizon. The air grew cooler and clearer, filled with the scent of pine and sage. On the 10th day of their journey, as they made their way through a particularly beautiful valley dotted with aspen groves and wildflower meadows, Elias suddenly reined in the horses. "We're here," he said simply, gesturing toward the vista that spread before them. Jillian caught her breath at the sight. The valley narrowed ahead, cradled between 2 gentle ridges that rose toward more dramatic peaks beyond. A creek much larger than the one in Copper Creek wound through the center, its banks lined with cottonwoods and willows. In the distance, she could make out a small cabin nestled against the eastern slope, smoke rising from its chimney. "It's even more beautiful than you described," she said softly, taking in the wild, pristine landscape that would be their home. Elias's eyes were on her face rather than the scenery, gauging her reaction. "The cabin belongs to Jacob Miller and his wife Sarah," he explained. "They're our nearest neighbors, about a mile upstream. Our land begins there," he pointed to a large boulder formation, "and extends along the creek for nearly 2 miles, then up into those timber stands on both sides." "It's perfect," Jillian breathed, already imagining the possibilities contained within this sheltered valley. As they approached the boundary marker, Elias suddenly handed her the reins. "Would you like to drive us onto our land?" he asked, his smile both tender and proud. Jillian accepted the leather straps with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the moment. With a gentle flick of the reins, she guided the horses forward, crossing the invisible line that separated their future from their past. "Welcome home, Jillian Abernathy," Elias said as they passed the boulder marker home. The word resonated within her, filling spaces that had been empty for too long. This wild, beautiful valley represented not just a physical place, but the beginning of a new chapter 1. She was writing not from necessity or grief, but from choice and hope. The Millers proved to be as welcoming as Elias had promised, emerging from their cabin as the wagon approached. Jacob was a weathered man in his 50s with a shock of white hair and a ready smile. Sarah, some years younger, had a practical air about her that Jillian immediately appreciated. "So you're the schoolteacher Elias wouldn't stop talking about," Sarah said after introductions were made, her eyes twinkling with friendly assessment. "I'm glad to finally meet you. We've been sorely in need of educated company in these parts." "Don't let her fool you," Jacob added with a chuckle. "Sarah's better read than most professors I've met. Been teaching our children and half the other youngsters in the valley for years." Over a simple but hearty meal in the Miller's cabin, Jillian learned more about the small community scattered throughout the valley and neighboring areas, about 20 families in all, with children of various ages who indeed gathered at the Miller cabin 3 days a week for lessons. "But I'm no trained teacher," Sarah admitted. "Just doing my best with what I know. If you're willing to take over, I'd be more than grateful." "I'd be honored," Jillian replied, warming to the idea of resuming her teaching career in this new setting. "Once we're settled, of course." The conversation turned to practical matters, the challenges of the coming winter, the progress Elias had made on their own cabin during his brief visit, before returning to Copper Creek. The supplies they would need to acquire before the mountain passes became difficult to traverse. "You're welcome to stay with us until your place is ready," Jacob offered, but Elias shook his head. "The cabin's weathertight and has the basic furnishings," he said. "We'll be comfortable enough, and I don't want to impose on your hospitality." Jillian felt a flutter of nervous anticipation at the realization that she and Elias would be living together immediately, without the buffer of time she had half expected. They had not discussed marriage directly, both seeming to understand that such a formal step would come after they had established themselves in their new home. As if sensing her thoughts, Elias added, "I'll be bunking in the lean-to until we've had time to sort out arrangements." His eyes met hers across the table, communicating understanding and respect for her position. The relief that flooded through Jillian was mixed with a curious disappointment that surprised her. Their relationship had developed with such unusual speed that conventional boundaries seemed somehow arbitrary, yet she appreciated Elias's consideration of her reputation and comfort. After the meal, as the sun began its descent behind the western mountains, Jacob helped Elias transfer Jillian's trunk and their supplies to the wagon while Sarah took her on a tour of the small garden she maintained behind the cabin. "It's not easy farming at this altitude," the older woman explained, gesturing toward rows of hardy vegetables. "But you learn what works. Potatoes, carrots, cabbage, they all do well. Beans too, if you get them in early enough." Jillian absorbed the information eagerly, knowing her own survival would depend on such practical knowledge. "I grew up helping in my mother's garden," she said, "but Pennsylvania is very different from Colorado." Sarah patted her arm encouragingly. "You'll adapt, we all do out here." As they prepared to leave, Sarah pressed a bundle into Jillian's hands: freshly baked bread, a crock of butter, and a jar of preserved peaches. "To start your larder," she said with a warm smile. "We'll be by tomorrow to help you get properly settled." The sun was setting as they finally arrived at their own cabin, casting long shadows across the clearing where Elias had begun the process of creating a home. The structure itself was small but solidly built of pine logs chinked with mud and straw. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a lean-to addition had been constructed along the back wall, presumably the space where Elias intended to sleep. "It's not much yet," he said apologetically as he helped her down from the wagon, "but it's a beginning." Jillian stood in the clearing, taking in the simple cabin with its surrounding wilderness, and felt a surge of emotion too complex to name. This wasn't the life she had envisioned when she left Pennsylvania with Thomas, nor was it anything she could have imagined during those dark months in Copper Creek. It was something entirely new, a life chosen rather than accepted, a future built on mutual respect and growing affection rather than youthful dreams. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it with all her heart. Elias's smile was radiant in the fading light. "Let me show you inside." The cabin's interior was indeed basic but thoughtfully arranged. A large fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking crane extending from its depths. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the main room, and a curtained alcove in one corner concealed what Jillian assumed was a sleeping area. Shelves had been built along one wall, currently empty but waiting to hold the books and keepsakes she had brought with her. "The bedroom's through there," Elias explained, gesturing toward the curtained space. "It's small, but I thought you'd appreciate the privacy." Jillian nodded, touched by his consideration. "And you'll be in the lean-to, just until." He trailed off, then began again more directly. "Jillian, I want to be clear about my intentions. I didn't bring you all this way simply as a companion or a helper. I hope that in time, when you're ready, you'll consider becoming my wife." Though she had anticipated this conversation, the direct proposal still caught her off guard. Jillian looked up at Elias, seeing in his face the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that she felt in her own heart. "I care for you deeply," she said carefully. "More than I thought possible after losing Thomas. But marriage is a significant step, especially in a place like this where there's no easy way out if things don't work between us." Elias nodded, his expression serious. "I understand. I'm not asking for an answer now. Just wanted you to know where I stand, and that whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'm here." The sincerity in his voice moved her deeply. This was a man who had lived enough of life to understand its complexities, who wasn't rushing toward commitment out of youthful impetuosity, but from a place of genuine care and consideration. "Thank you," she said simply, reaching for his hand, "for understanding and for giving me time." He squeezed her fingers gently before releasing them. "Let me get a fire started. The nights can be cool up here, even in summer." As Elias busied himself with the fireplace, Jillian explored the small cabin more thoroughly, noting the care that had gone into its construction. The logs were well fitted, the floor had been smoothed and swept clean, and the few pieces of furniture, though rough, were sturdily built. Through the single window, now reflecting her own image against the darkening exterior, she could see the outline of mountains against the star-filled sky. This was to be her home now, not a temporary shelter like her room in Copper Creek, but a place where she could put down roots, build a life, perhaps eventually raise a family. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. By the time Elias had a fire crackling in the hearth, Jillian had unpacked some of her belongings, arranging her books on the empty shelves and placing her mother's jewelry box on the small table beside the bed. These small touches of familiarity helped anchor her in this new environment, bridging the gap between her past and her future. They shared a simple supper of Sarah's bread and butter, along with jerky and coffee Elias prepared over the fire. Conversation flowed easily between them, focused on practical plans for the coming days: fencing to be built, supplies to be purchased from the nearest trading post, introductions to be made to other families in the valley. As the evening deepened and weariness from the day's journey began to settle over them, Elias rose from his chair. "I should let you get some rest," he said. "It's been a long day." Jillian nodded, suddenly shy at the prospect of this first night alone together, even with the lean to providing separation. "Thank you for everything, Elias, for bringing me here for this new beginning," he smiled, his eyes warm in the firelight. "Thank you for taking the chance, for trusting me enough to come." For a moment they stood facing each other, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the small cabin. Then Elias leaned forward, his lips brushing hers in a gentle goodnight kiss that held promise rather than demand. "Sleep well, Jillian," he murmured before stepping back. "Tomorrow we start building our life here." After he had gone, taking a blanket and pillow to the lean-to, Jillian prepared for bed in the small alcove, her body tired but her mind still active with the events of the day. Through the cabin's single window, she could see the vast expanse of stars overhead, brighter and more numerous than they had ever appeared in Copper Creek. As she drifted toward sleep, Jillian realized that for the first time since Thomas's death, she was looking forward to the dawn not with resignation, but with genuine anticipation. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and she harbored no illusions that life in this beautiful but demanding landscape would be easy. She would face them not alone, but with a partner who saw her strength rather than her vulnerability. The days that followed established a rhythm of work and companionship that suited them both. Elias focused on the physical labor of preparing the homestead for the coming season's repairing fences, constructing a small barn for the horses and the milk cow he planned to purchase, clearing ground for a garden plot that would be planted the following spring. Jillian, meanwhile, transformed the interior of the cabin into a true home. With Sarah Miller's guidance, she learned to manage the peculiarities of cooking over an open hearth, to preserve the wild berries that grew abundantly along the creek banks, and to anticipate the needs of a household in a place where the nearest general store was a full day's journey away. True to Sarah's word, the neighboring families made a point of visiting, each bringing small gifts to welcome the newcomers: jars of honey, hand-sewn quilts, packets of seeds saved from their own gardens. With each introduction, Jillian felt herself becoming more integrated into the tight-knit community that had formed in this remote valley. "Mrs. Reynolds says her 3 children haven't had proper schooling in over a year," she told Elias one evening as they sat on the rough bench he had constructed outside the cabin door. "And the Thompsons have twins who are just learning to read. There's a real need for a teacher here." Elias nodded, his arm resting comfortably along the back of the bench behind her shoulders. "I told you the community would welcome your skills. Have you thought about where you might hold classes? Sarah has offered the use of their main room until something more permanent can be arranged. It's centrally located for most of the families. We could build a proper schoolhouse by next summer," Elias suggested. "I've been talking with Jacob about sawing lumber from the stand of pine on our property. Some of it could go toward a school building." The casual way he included her work in his plans for their future touched Jillian deeply. Unlike some men who might view a wife's occupation as secondary or temporary, Elias clearly respected her calling as a teacher and saw it as integral to their shared life. As August gave way to September, the nights grew cooler and the aspen trees began their transformation from green to gold. Elias continued to sleep in the lean-to, though their days were spent in increasingly comfortable companionship. Each evening after supper, they would sit together by the fire, sometimes reading aloud from one of Jillian's books, sometimes simply talking until the embers burned low. It was during one such evening, with the first snow of the season dusting the higher elevations visible from their clearing, that Jillian finally gave voice to the decision that had been forming in her heart for weeks. "Elias," she began, setting aside the book she had been reading. "I've been thinking about what you said when we first arrived about your intentions." He looked up from the bridle he was mending, his expression carefully neutral despite the sudden alertness in his posture. "Yes. I care for you deeply," she continued, the words coming more easily than she had expected. These past months have shown me not just what kind of man you are, but what kind of life we might build together, and I find that I want that life with you very much." The bridle slipped from Elias's fingers as he absorbed her words. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying yes," Jillian confirmed, a smile spreading across her face. "Yes, I'll marry you, Elias Blackwood." In an instant he was beside her, kneeling at her feet, his hands capturing hers. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't want you to feel pressured because of our situation here." "I've never been more certain of anything," she assured him, freeing one hand to touch his cheek. "My answer would be the same whether we were here, or in Philadelphia, or anywhere else on Earth." The joy that transformed his features was answer enough, but he pulled her gently into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that communicated more than words ever could. When they finally parted, both breathless, Elias rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Jillian Abernathy," he whispered. "I think I have since that first night in the dining room, when I saw you sitting alone and thought no woman with eyes as beautiful as yours should ever have to dine by herself." "I love you too," she replied, the words no longer frightening but liberating. "And I'm very glad you decided to join me that evening." The following Sunday, beneath the golden canopy of aspens along the creek bank, Jillian Abernathy became Jillian Blackwood in a simple ceremony officiated by Jacob Miller, who had once been a circuit preacher before settling in the valley. The entire community gathered to witness the union, bringing food and music and warm wishes for the couple who had already become valued members of their extended family. Sarah Miller stood as Jillian's witness, while Jacob performed double duty as both officiant and Elias's best man. The bride wore her best dress, the burgundy one she had worn on their first real dinner together, with a crown of late wildflowers in her hair. Elias, cleaned and polished to a degree Jillian had never seen, wore his good shirt and string tie, his dark hair slicked back though one rebellious lock still fell across his forehead. "I, Elias James Blackwood, take you, Jillian Marie Abernathy, to be my lawful wedded wife," he vowed, his voice steady and sure as he held her hands in his. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." As Jillian repeated the same words, she felt not the nervous anticipation of her first wedding but a deep, settled certainty that this was right, that the unexpected journey from that lonely supper in Copper Creek to this sunlit ceremony beside a mountain stream had been leading her home all along. After the simple reception, as twilight began to gather among the trees and their neighbors departed with final congratulations and knowing smiles, Elias lifted Jillian into his arms to carry her across the threshold of their cabin. Inside, she saw that in her absence that morning, he had transformed the space. Fresh pine boughs decorated the mantel, new curtains hung at the window, and the sleeping alcove had been arranged with clean linens and more wildflowers in a pottery vase. "When did you do all this?" she asked, touched by the effort he had made to make their wedding night special despite the rustic surroundings. "I had help," he admitted with a smile. "Sarah and some of the other women came by while you were getting ready at the Millers. They said every bride deserves a proper bridal chamber, even in the wilderness." Setting her gently on her feet, Elias reached into his pocket and withdrew a small buckskin pouch. "I have something for you," he said, suddenly appearing almost shy. "It's not much, but—" From the pouch, he produced a ring, a simple band of gold with a small pearl set into its surface. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right woman to wear it." Tears filled Jillian's eyes as he slipped the ring onto her finger, where it settled as though made for her. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "and perfect." The kiss that followed deepened quickly, months of restrained desire finally finding expression now that they were husband and wife. With gentle hands, Elias began to unfasten the buttons at the back of her dress, his fingers trembling slightly despite his evident determination to move slowly. "I've wanted to do this since that first night by the creek," he murmured against her neck, his breath warm on her skin. "To show you with my body what my words could never fully express. Show me now," Jillian invited, her own hands working at the buttons of his shirt. "We have all night and all the nights to come." Later, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts in what was now truly their shared bed, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall outside the cabin window. Jillian watched them drift past the glass, illuminated by the moonlight that filtered through breaks in the clouds. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns along her bare shoulder. "I'm thinking about that night in the dining room," she replied, turning to face him. "How differently my life might have turned out if you hadn't noticed me sitting alone, if you hadn't decided to join me." He smiled, pulling her closer against his warmth. "I like to think we would have found each other somehow, somewhere. Some connections are meant to be, no matter what path we take to reach them." As sleep began to claim them both, Jillian reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment, from the hopeful bride leaving Pennsylvania, to the grieving widow in Copper Creek, to the woman who now lay in the arms of a man who had seen her true self from the first moment. A man who had decided that no night of hers should be lonely, and in doing so, had ensured that his own nights would never be solitary again. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their small corner of the Colorado wilderness in pristine white, a clean page upon which their shared story would continue to be written, day by day, season by season, year by year, together. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure, as life in the Colorado territory demanded resilience from all who chose to make it their home. The winter of 1879 proved particularly harsh, with snowdrifts reaching the cabin's window sills and temperatures dropping so low that ink froze in its bottle on the table by the fire. But within their snug dwelling, Elias and Jillian found warmth not just in the well-stocked hearth, but in the deepening bond between them. By spring, when the first wildflowers began to push through the retreating snow along the creek banks, Jillian had news that brought both joy and trepidation to their household. She was with child, due to deliver as the aspen leaves turned gold once more. "Are you happy?" she asked Elias one evening as they sat on their bench, watching the sunset paint the western mountains in shades of pink and gold. His hand, which had been resting protectively over the gentle swell of her belly, tightened slightly. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he replied, his voice thick with emotion, and terrified all at the same time. Jillian laughed softly, understanding completely. "Me too, but Sarah says that's normal for new parents, especially out here where doctors are scarce." Elias nodded, his expression growing serious. "I've been thinking about that. I want you to consider going to Denver for the birth. There are proper hospitals there, doctors who specialize in bringing babies into the world, and leave you here alone for weeks." Jillian shook her head firmly. "No, Elias. This baby will be born here, in the home you built for us, with Sarah to help as she's helped a dozen other women in the valley." Though concern still lingered in his eyes, Elias recognized the determination in his wife's voice. "All right," he conceded. "But I'm going to make sure we have everything possible on hand to ensure both of you are safe." True to his word, over the following months, Elias made several trips to the nearest large settlement, returning with supplies that transformed one corner of their cabin into a makeshift birthing room. Clean linens, special herbs recommended by Sarah, even a book on midwifery that he had ordered from Denver. Nothing was too much trouble if it might contribute to Jillian's comfort and safety. Meanwhile, the school Jillian had established continued to thrive, though as her pregnancy advanced, she reluctantly agreed to limit her teaching to 3 mornings a week, rather than the full 5 she had originally maintained. The older children helped with the younger ones, creating a community of learning that functioned effectively even with her reduced presence. As September approached, bringing with it the first hints of autumn in the higher elevations, preparations for the baby's arrival intensified. Elias completed the cradle he had been crafting from aspen wood, its smooth surfaces polished to a soft glow. Jillian, with Sarah's guidance, sewed tiny garments from soft flannel, each stitch a prayer for the child who would wear them. On the evening of September 28, 1879, as the harvest moon rose full and golden over the eastern ridge, Jillian felt the first contractions begin. She had been preparing supper, stirring a pot of venison stew over the fire, when the initial pain gripped her, causing her to grasp the edge of the hearth for support. "Elias," she called, her voice steady despite the sudden knowledge that their child was ready to enter the world. He appeared instantly in the doorway, arms laden with firewood for the evening. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. The wood clattered to the floor as he crossed the room to her side. "Is it time?" he asked, his hand gently supporting her elbow. Jillian nodded, offering a small smile despite the discomfort. "I think so. The pains have just started, though. There's time to send for Sarah." Elias helped her to the bed before racing to saddle his horse, his face a study in controlled panic. "I'll be back as quickly as possible," he promised, pausing only long enough to press a kiss to her forehead before disappearing into the gathering dusk. Left alone, Jillian moved carefully around the cabin, completing the preparations they had discussed for this moment. She added wood to the fire, ensuring the room would stay warm throughout the night. She arranged the clean linens within easy reach and filled the kettle with fresh water to heat. These practical tasks helped distract her from the intensifying contractions, which were still spaced widely enough to allow her to work between them. By the time Elias returned with Sarah Miller in tow, Jillian had changed into a loose nightgown and was sitting calmly in the rocking chair he had made for her, one hand resting on her swollen belly as she breathed through a contraction. "Well now," Sarah said approvingly as she bustled into the cabin, removing her shawl and immediately washing her hands in the basin Jillian had prepared. "This looks like a woman ready to meet her child. How far apart are the pains, dear?" "About 15 minutes, Jillian replied, grateful for the older woman's calm competence. "They started just over an hour ago," Sarah nodded, turning to Elias who hovered anxiously nearby. "We've got plenty of time then. Why don't you make sure the horses are settled and bring in more firewood? We'll need to keep the cabin warm through the night." The suggestion of practical tasks seemed to steady him. With a last glance at Jillian, who nodded reassuringly, Elias went to attend to the necessary chores, leaving the women to the ancient business of preparing for birth. The labor progressed steadily through the night, neither alarmingly fast nor worryingly slow according to Sarah's experienced assessment. Jillian moved between the bed and the rocking chair as comfort dictated, walking the length of the cabin during the earlier stages when movement helped ease the pain of contractions. Elias remained close by, following Sarah's instructions with the focus and determination he brought to all important tasks. He heated water, fetched clean cloths, and most importantly, provided unwavering support to Jillian, holding her hand through contractions, rubbing her back when the pain settled there, murmuring encouragement when her strength seemed to flag. "You're doing beautifully," Sarah assured her as dawn approached and the labor intensified. "The baby's head is engaged now, it won't be much longer." Jillian, exhausted but determined, nodded from her position on the bed where she now remained, the contractions coming too quickly and powerfully to allow for movement. Elias sat behind her, supporting her back and shoulders, his face lined with concern but his voice steady as he talked her through each wave of pain. "Remember when we crossed the river on our journey here?" He reminisced between contractions, trying to distract her. "The wagon got stuck midstream and you were certain we'd lose everything. But we didn't. We made it through together, just like we'll make it through this." As the first rays of sunrise filtered through the cabin window, Sarah announced that it was time to push. Jillian gathered her remaining strength, focusing on the task with the same determination she brought to everything in her life. Elias continued to support her physically and emotionally, his presence an anchor in the storm of pain and effort. "I can see the head," Sarah reported after several productive pushes. "Dark hair, just like its father's." With a few more tremendous efforts, their child slipped into the world and immediately announced its arrival with a lusty cry that filled the small cabin. Sarah efficiently tied and cut the cord before placing the squalling infant on Jillian's chest. "You have a daughter," she announced, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Jillian looked down at the red-faced, indignant creature who had caused her so many hours of pain, and felt her heart expand with a love so profound, it took her breath away. Beside her, Elias made a sound that was half laugh, half sob as he reached out to touch his daughter's tiny hand with one tentative finger. "She's perfect," he whispered, awe evident in his voice. "Absolutely perfect." As Sarah busied herself with the final stages of the birth and the initial care of both mother and child, Elias and Jillian remained in their own world, marveling at the miracle they had created together. The baby, now cleaned and swaddled in one of the soft flannel blankets Jillian had prepared, had quieted in her mother's arms, her eyes already showing hints of Elias's striking blue, gazing solemnly up at the faces of her parents. "What shall we call her?" Elias asked, his finger now firmly clasped in his daughter's surprisingly strong grip. Jillian considered for a moment, looking down at the child who represented so much their love, their future, the life they were building together in this wild and beautiful place. "Elizabeth," she decided. "Elizabeth Sarah Blackwood." She glanced up at Sarah, who was tidying the birthing area. "If that's all right with you," the older woman's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "I'd be honored," she said simply. Later that day, after Sarah had departed with promises to return the following morning to check on mother and child, Elias and Jillian lay together on their bed, Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in the cradle beside them. The autumn sunlight streamed through the window, gilding the scene with its warm glow. "I never imagined I could feel this way," Elias confessed, his voice soft with wonder. "When I saw you in that dining room, I knew there was something special about you. I knew I wanted to know you better. But I never dreamed that less than 2 years later, we'd be here with a daughter of our own." Jillian smiled, tired but content in a way she had never experienced before. "Life has a way of surprising us," she observed. "When Thomas died, I thought my chance at happiness had ended before it truly began. I couldn't see any future beyond just surviving day to day." She turned to face him, reaching up to trace the beloved features that had become as familiar to her as her own. "But then you walked into that dining room and something changed. You saw me not just the widow in mourning, but the woman beneath. You decided that no night of mine should be lonely, and in doing so, you changed both our lives forever." Elias captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Best decision I ever made," he murmured. "Though I'm not sure it was really a decision at all, more like recognizing something that was meant to be." As Elizabeth stirred in her cradle, making the small sounds that preceded waking, Jillian reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a chance meeting in a frontier town to this cabin in the Colorado wilderness, now filled with the presence of their child. It wasn't the life she had planned or expected, but it was infinitely more precious for being unexpected, for being chosen rather than merely accepted. "I love you, Elias Blackwood," she said simply, the words containing all the gratitude and joy and hope that filled her heart. "And I love you, Jillian Blackwood," he replied, his smile as bright as the autumn sunlight that blessed their home. "Always will." As they rose together to attend to their daughter's needs, Jillian knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead in life in this beautiful but demanding place would surely bring many they would face them as they had faced all others. Side by side, with the strength that came from having found in each other not just love but true partnership. And she knew, too, that no night of hers would ever be lonely again.